So thank you again. Before we turn to questions from the audience, I have a question for the panel to think about. This morning, our CEO, Jack Lohman, talked about modernization and the recent commitment we've had from the provincial government for funds in the new budget to modernize the museum. In terms of the collections, what are some of the key modernizations you would like to see in your area? Casey, I see you have a microphone, so I might ask you to go first.
Funny you should ask that. Certainly, we have issues with the preservation of our collection, as all museums do. There's always more that we can do to prolong the lives of the artifacts in our care, and our mandate here is to preserve it for the current public of British Columbia and elsewhere, but also for the visitors of the future, the researchers of the future. So in terms of the presentation that I gave today, we're at a crossroads with our plastics in our collections. We've been able to deal with a lot of the plastics, the cellulose nitrate and acetate in the archival collections, but as I mentioned, in the museum, both the modern history department as well as the indigenous collections and to a lesser extent the natural history collections, we have a fair bit of plastic and it's actively deteriorating. We want to find a way that we can store and share and display these objects without seeing them disintegrating before our eyes. So it's a real conundrum. We know that cold storage works, minus 20 degrees, shut it up and don't touch it again. But that's just not on the table for us. So I'm hoping that with our modernization project we have an opportunity to either incorporate additional cold storage in our potential new buildings or look at a way that we can store these things at room temperature and keep them accessible to the public.
I would echo all of that, and I would also suggest that what we're doing right now, researching, should also be a priority. So more space and space to accommodate more equipment so that we can continue the research that we're doing here. We're very fortunate right now that we have a lot of external partners that are able to offer funding and equipment, but bringing some of that equipment in the doors here means that we can then offer it to more, maybe smaller institutions throughout the province as well.
I second everything that Lauren and Casey said. We definitely have a lot of partnerships and we have restricted space right now, so having a bit more space would be great. There are also urgent needs throughout the province that we have the opportunity to become leaders on. Things like waterlogged perishable materials. There are no labs in British Columbia and currently things are sent to Ottawa, so we have a chance to be leaders in that if we establish labs like that. Also increasing space, because we have a wonderful contingent of volunteers and we just don't have enough space to accommodate them all right now, so more space for that would be great.
Can I pop in once more before I'm being selfish? Furthermore, not just behind the scenes, but I think the needs of the public are changing as well, and we're operating in buildings that were built for a particular purpose several years ago. The way collections are used and the way researchers need to use them is changing as well, so bigger spaces and also flexible spaces that allow for collaborative work, for some of the more sensitive material to be dealt with in a more sensitive and private way. All of that would be helpful as well.
In the digital age, we have to really try to make a huge effort to get digitized versions of everything we have that's available online. But over the last 48 years, I know what the public want because I get teachers and students. They want information about their area, and what I'd like to see doing is kind of overviews of a lot of things we have in our collection, so people go on, oh, they have some of that stuff. That's what I want to look at. Or do they have any collections from our community? It's really important to get that out there on our website, to allow them to have access to what we do have in the collection, and to get a lot more summary articles and visuals out there that we know people want to use.
Thank you, everyone. Emma, could I ask, if it doesn't interrupt the recording, can we just have a little extra light on the audience so we can see who's asking the questions? It's surprisingly difficult to see with that light here. So, over to the audience. Do we have any questions from you? Ah, there you are. Oh, two at all at once. Director Umalisa.
Yes, thank you. I'm interested in repatriation, and probably I'm glad I'll have an opportunity to say something coming. But when we talk about repatriation, and all of you have such a good education, most of you, if not all, are doctors, and you have acquired knowledge to get that PhD in things. But that knowledge was on top of the people you were dealing, or the objects you're dealing with. Are you going to repatriate that knowledge? How are you going to do it?
Could you just also repeat the question for folks who may not have heard it?
How are we going to repatriate the knowledge in regard to things that we have? So one of the big requests that First Nations want, they want tapes. Somebody recorded the great-grandfather of 50 people in this band. They've never heard their grandfather talking. We could digitize that and give it to the band. Everybody in that family, they have all that. Just, you don't have to give them the physical object. You make a digitized copy. So you get them the tapes, get them the photographs, and we want to get all this stuff to all the First Nations that want it. It's part of their history, and then we would like to work with them in describing those for them to add to it. So what we have right now behind the scenes, we have First Nations for a number of years now coming in, looking at these little photographs, and there's 6 people, and we don't have the names of any of them. And an elder comes in and says, "That's my Aunt May." So we write down her name. She gave Aunt May. So we've been documenting that for years. So now when all these images go back, all the information goes back, those First Nations are now going to interpret their history. They're going to know more about it than us if there's anything that's of the time period that relates to them. So that's the priority of First Nations. That's what they're telling us. So we are going like crazy getting that material digitized, and it's something they really express that they appreciate enormously. So when it comes to other cultural, physical, three-dimensional cultural images, we've already gone through the process of returning that material. Say many First Nations, they don't have the facilities. They might make arrangements of how it's used. So they say, we want you to keep it safely here for us. Maybe 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now, we'll have a cultural center and to put that material in. So we have individual agreements with many different First Nations that, to return material in the future. There's sometimes only certain things they're interested in. The vast majority of what we have in the ethnology collection are things made for sale. So we might have something dated to 1916, but it was a First Nation who made it to sell it, and the museum bought it. So the ethnology is a current thing going back a long way. It's not, some people have this idea, all this old stuff was stolen. Well, the vast majority is purchased. And so First Nations have to identify to us what is important to you, and then that's the material that they want back, that's what they get back. And where there's material they don't want to work together to enhance the information about those collections, there's certain things they don't want displayed, but they want to leave it in our museum, but they want members of their band to be able to come in private and observe that material, for their artists to come and learn from the copy the designs that we have. So we've had many First Nations that come in. One person came in a few weeks back. I didn't know my grandfather. He made 3 masks that you have in our collection. Can I see them? And now that person is learning from the style of his grandfather and recreating those masks. So this is the kind of thing we want to encourage more and more access. And I think with the building of a new building, we try to design it in such a way to make it easy for those people. We have a special room where elders come in, and in a peaceful, quiet room where they get to observe things. And what we ask them, what do you want? How do you want to observe this stuff? And we try to accommodate those people in whatever way they want.
Maybe, Genevieve, could you speak a little bit to the repatriation handbook?
I'll start off by adding to what Grant was saying about creating these spaces. I think in order to repatriate this knowledge, we have to let communities know that this is a space that's welcoming to them. For a long time, I'm not sure that message was reaching communities. So that's one of the steps. The second step that I would say is that we have an increasing number of Indigenous co-op students and interns, and we're hoping to get an Indigenous internship program revamped. There was one in the 90s, was that? Yeah. And Lucy Bell, our head of First Nations and Repatriation, was part of that. And then the third way is the repatriation handbook. So working with the Haida Gwaii Museum and Nika Collison, our department worked on this handbook that helps guide communities through the process of repatriation using examples from other communities that have done this, and provides sort of a very transparent behind-the-scenes exploration of what are all the steps involved, logistics, emotional and things like that. I hope that answers your question.
Axel, you had a question as well.
Yes, it's addressed to Casey. Deterioration of plastics is essentially a chemical process, although it can be triggered by mechanical and irradiation as well, which are not strictly chemical. My question is basically this: are there gaps in knowledge in understanding the chemistry of deterioration? And if there are gaps in knowledge, who is working to fill them, and are we partnering with them?
Sure, good question. One of the problems with plastics is that there is no such thing as plastic. It's a catch-all term for polymers that most of them originate in natural materials and have been modified through various chemical means, and there are additives, stabilizers, a lot of different constituents in them that change from manufacturer to manufacturer. They change for the purpose of what the object is, whether you want it to be. Another word for the use of the word plastic is you want it to be movable and flexible, or you want it to be hard like a telephone case. So one of the first things that we have to do is analyze the constituents of the plastics to understand the process of deterioration. There's a lot of work going on in this. There are chemists and scientists with a lot more credentials than I have working on this. I attended a workshop last year at the Canadian Conservation Institute. They were hosting the preeminent researcher right now, Yvonne Shashoa from the National Museum of Denmark. And she has partners all over the world in analytical labs working on this. They're doing a lot of tests with accelerated aging. The problem is that a lot of these scientists don't have access to collections. So they can work with polymers in their purest form. They can work with polymers that have been separated from the objects, samples of the objects. What they don't have is a collection at their disposal. So when I was formulating the research project, I used the advice of Yvonne, we spoke many times through email, and then refined the scope of the project with our partner at the Canadian Conservation Institute, where they have a lot of analytical equipment, and she was able to guide me in areas of research around the world that are covered right now, and her assertion was that what they don't have is real-life objects to work on. So this is where we came up with the idea of using objects from our history collection and putting them through some of these processes, because we know that these chemical reactions slow down when the temperature is lowered, when we remove oxygen, when we remove water in the air. And so we know how to do it, but what we don't have is an idea of how we can use this in the museum field, and broader than that to plastics in industry and in home use everywhere else in society. But we're in a unique position here at the museum to test some of the hypotheses using the research that is currently being done.
Thank you.
I would add to that too, while most chemists don't have access to a collection, most collection staff don't have free reign over a chemistry lab and the assistance of scientists on staff. So again, another push for on-site research facilities. I think the study of deterioration also starts with the study of the actual materials that you're looking at, and we are doing technical art studies on-site here. And also we are very fortunate to have the Canadian Conservation Institute, which is set up as a national center for the pairing of science and conservation, and we do work very closely with them, so we're lucky to have that.
Janet?
I have a question for Lauren. Intriguing about Yokohama works, and knowing that Victoria has many people from away, but also a lot of people who have generations, who lived here for generations. Are you planning on using social media in some way to outreach to those families, to actually ask if there are other examples within this collection? I mean, community engagement is a wonderful way to kind of reach out, and do you have the capacity right now to actually, if you sent it out there, and it came back to you tenfold, would you be able to proceed with that? So I'm kind of looking at your capacity for research and amongst all the many things that you have to do, and is social media going to actually be part of your research going forward?
Absolutely. I kind of thought of this as the first step in all of that, actually. I'm continuing the research, and I'm also planning to do a similar presentation for other conservators within the province, in hopes that if there are other Yokohama A in a lot of other institutions, I can kind of start there, and hopefully that there is documented provenance that goes with them that would again illuminate a little bit more about how those objects have come to BC. And then from there, I would absolutely love to cast a wider net and see if anybody individually has any of these paintings in their collection and can contribute to the research. That would be very helpful. Again, if anybody here has any similar materials in their personal collection, please do find me. That would be great.
Yes, just here.
I have a question, because right now, when we're all think about it, but is this building earthquake ready?
Your question is, is this building seismically up to date? No, it is not. It's definitely one of the drivers for modernization.
I guess so.
Leah?
I almost hesitate to ask this question, but I'm the moderator for a session tomorrow on participatory culture, and I'm just wondering about what I perceive to be, and perhaps I'm wrong about that, but this tension between offering greater access to the collections with respect to research and with those people that we would like to collaborate with in terms of research. And how do we, and do you have opinions on how we, on the one hand, create greater access to the collections, but on the other, we take care, as we're mandated to do, to preserve this material for the long term. And I'd just be interested to know what your thoughts are on that tension.
I think that's the crux of conservation, really, is the balance between preservation and access. And I think it's important to think of access not just as access by contemporary members of society, but also access for future generations. So we're all proponents of access in that regard. But it's normally falls to the conservators to advocate for that future access, which is why we are often the bad guys that have to put in the rules as to how much light certain materials can receive and how long they can be on display for and that sort of thing. But the whole point in having a collection is that people are able to use it. So I think access has to play a central role.
Thanks. I'd also like to add that access, we have to keep the broader perspective and realize that access for our visitors today is critically important, but also we have to try and retain access for their children and their children's children in the future. So that's why I think we're very excited across this organization right now, because if we do have some redevelopment of our collection storage and exhibit spaces potentially, we'll have opportunities to increase access while also at the same time increasing our preservation environments for the collections. So dynamic tension it is, but exciting.
I just wanted to say a word with regard to archaeology. I mean, in large part, we have over 230,000 individual objects in the collection, and about 90% of that is made out of stone. So providing access to members of the public, First Nations communities, for us, hasn't been as challenging as some other departments. However, in looking at studies about the original material culture that First Nations communities used, stone only represented less than 5% of the entire assemblage. So as we go forward in time, one of the things that we are trying to facilitate the preservation of is all of the wooden perishable materials that these cultures use that form 95% of the original assemblage. And so we're going to have to turn to things like not only traditional conservation methods like polyethylene glycol and things like that, but then in order to make it accessible to the public and not handleable, but turn to things like 3D modeling and other digital technologies to provide that access in a safe way.
Creating more plastic.
Okay, when we often invite a First Nation group to come to the museum, we say, what is it you want to see? Well, they don't really necessarily know what we have or what we do with it. So when they come behind the scenes, we might visit archaeology, ethnology, photographic collection, we see what they're interested in, what they want, and they get to understand what it is we have. We have stuff, and they say, oh, I didn't realize you had that stuff. So they go away having a real clear idea of what we have, what we do. So I bring all the stuff in their traditional territory, I would bring it up and show them. So they go away, they have no strange ideas about what we have in the collection. So some First Nations from the far north have come here and they say, we want to see all the stuff that was stolen from our traditional territory. And in one case we had some moccasins and a doeskin hat, both of which I donated. They came from a friend of my mother's. That's all we had from their territory. So, wow, this is not what they heard before. So it's important that they go away with a clear understanding of what we do here, what we have, how we deal with it. So they can decide and talk among themselves, what do we want to do in the future? So if they want to create their own cultural center, their own repository for archaeological material, we help them try to get that done. So I see it as that we learn from them, they learn from us, and we meet this medium. So far, it's been excellent relationships, and everybody goes away happy. So.
In regards to access, I'd like to add from the education department or the learning department's point of view, we also know not everyone can get here to the museum. So physical access, there's a barrier. It might be travel, distance, or just having the money to do that. So we work to provide outreach for communities across British Columbia. We have kits that we send out, often with reproductions, but very good reproductions of material in our collections. And we also have an education handling collection. We're currently also having a lot of popularity with our digital visits. So this is where a classroom in Northern BC can Skype in with Grant and go into the collection with him, and that's just 2 people and a camera, and so not a lot of risk there to that area. I'd also say that all of our staff in the collections area have been so generous in allowing us access. We do have behind-the-scenes tours that we offer to the public, and they make those spaces as available as we can with that limited space that we have up there. Other questions? Yes?
For Lauren, with regards to Yokohama A, I'm really curious what the interest may have been from the museums that you approached in Japan about this material. Did they have collections themselves of this material? If they did have collections, did it not only represent Westerns having this material done, did it even represent people from within their own culture?
The answer is yes. I approached the Katagawa Prefectural Museum and Yokohama is a city within that prefecture. Both the Prefectural Museum and the Yokohama City Museum have huge collections of Yokohama A. And while I referenced it mostly in terms of the tourist trade, it was actually a high art form for a while as well. The Emperor Meiji has a portrait done in Yokohama A as well as several high-ranking Japanese officials, and you saw the U.S. president portrait as well. So it wasn't just a tourist form of art, but the ones that we have in our BC collection here almost certainly are more tourist trade. That being said, it was much more popular over there. There were actually photographic studios that were set up adjacent to painting studios so that these could be commissioned kind of same day. You get the photograph taken, you get the painting done in the same place. So it was a big tradition, but in a very small area and only for about like 40 to 50 years, which is why in English there's not a lot of literature. Do a Google search, there's one article that comes up, so I poked around as much as I could, and when I got in touch with, luckily, 2 English-speaking curators in both of these institutions, they were able to send me English translations of articles they had published and an exhibit catalog from a huge exhibit that the Yokohama Museum of Art was able to do. So it's been really interesting learning something that is very well researched in one area, but just not available in English.
I have a question for the panel about research in general. So with such a huge collection, how do you make your priorities about what the research is going to be?
I guess I'm under fire. I have 2 research projects on the go right now. The Yokohama A was inspired just by finding some collection material and to be able to do my job, to identify what the material was and to accurately describe it so that other people could find it. That's what started this whole research project. Another research project that I'm working on is in terms of Emily Carr's works of art on paper. So that was inspired by my own personal interest, but also again by my work. I am going to be having to rehouse a lot of her materials, and knowing exactly what they're made out of determines how they're degrading, and that determines how I need to store them. So again, it's my research has been driven a little bit by my own personal interest, but mostly by what's come up as necessary in my work.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's pretty much all applied research in conservation, and it's usually to deal with issues at hand. And we have to do the investigation. Sometimes the investigation opens up a hole that we climb down, and we get very deep into those holes. And then reality sets in, and we have to get back to our work plans. So yeah, I've been involved in risk analysis research and a little bit on the archaeological combs recently that we were dealing with, and there's also been a little bit of research into how museums cooperate, how we put together emergency response plans and salvage of collections. So pretty wide ranging, quite often not driven by our own interests, but what needs to be done at the time.
There seems to be periods of real fads going on, like what are the whole weaving technology, spindle wools and that sort of thing were a really popular thing because the imagery of spindle wools is something among Salish language groups is really important. So I started putting together, because First Nations are asking us for information on that, so I put together an article summarizing all the small spindle wools, both in our archaeology and ethnology collection, and how far back in time those go. And one of the ones that I have on my agenda is to do a complete description of all the large spindle wools in our collection, so people outside will be able to visually see everything we have in our collection by the time I'm finished that article. And then I'm branching out in all the iconography and different aspects of that. The comb was mentioned. Okay, so I have about 50 articles that are different stages being finished. People kept phoning me, can you tell me how First Nations use combs? Oh, there must be lots of stuff on that. No, there isn't. The literature is just depleted with that information. So I'm looking at all the combs in ethnology, the very small numbers we have in archaeology, and find out combs aren't just combs. They're not just for combing your hair. They're for decorative items. There's combs that may or may not have been used for weaving. There's tattoo combs. There's all kinds of things we call combs, and I need to summarize everything that we have, and then put that in a broader context. So when that gets put online, many people are going to ask more questions, and they're going to start taking off from what I talked about and add to it. And then as more archaeologists find these, they'll have something to relate to, part of the story that they can add to. So I tend to be doing a lot of things. Sometimes they're my own interest, but I tend to key off what do people seem to want the most and try to get that put online.
I've been lucky enough to be able to work on several different research projects. And one of the things that guides me in my research projects is being able to create opportunities for our interns, volunteers, co-op students. A lot of our volunteers are undergraduates who are studying archaeology, anthropology, so to be able to give them hands-on experience is important. So any of you who were here last year at Research Day, I was working on a project that involves reflectance transformation imaging, which is a digital way of enhancing objects that are extremely faint. They use it in Europe a lot, looking at grave markers where you can't actually make out things with the naked eye, and we were using it on a series of mid-sized siltstones. I've also been lucky enough to work on a collaborative project with Cowichan Tribes and the Nature Conservancy of Canada, looking at some landscape archaeology. But I think lately the repatriation work has taken over much of my focus.
Yes.
I have a question for Lauren. Since you mentioned the Emily Carr paintings, I have often wondered why the museum has those paintings. The art gallery has just received a huge gift to build their new building, and they have quite a collection of Emily Carr paintings. Would they not be better served at the art gallery than the museum?
So the collection of Emily Carr works that we have at the Royal BC Museum, I believe was originally with the National Repository, and it got moved to the BC Archives. Again, we are hoping to expand the facility and therefore expand access to that collection as well. It's great to see that our colleagues at the AGGB are doing the same, and hopefully we'll collaborate with some of our research as well. The limitations with a lot of our collection, the bulk of Emily Carr paintings that we have the largest collection of her works on paper. The nature of works of art on paper is usually that they're just a lot more light sensitive. So we do, with preservation in mind, have to keep tabs on how often they're exhibited and making sure that there's not going to be huge color shifts and making sure that they're safe to give to the next generation as well. So we've got to balance that preservation and access, but yes, we hope to expand access coming up soon.
Well, with the new portion of the art gallery, surely the art gallery can do that.
Sorry?
Preserve the paintings on paper, like with the art gallery, no one would be able to do that.
I'm sure that they adhere to the same preservation standards. I don't think they have a paper conservator on staff, but I'm sure that they adhere to museum protocol.
I'm just thinking of fundraising for, this museum and the art gallery, and why the duplication, like this, with preserving these Emily Carr paintings.
I definitely would like to, the RBCM is definitely a resource for the province. So in terms of preservation, if there's need for our services elsewhere, I think we're all on board to start collaborating for research purposes, and I'm always available for individuals as well as other institutions in terms of how to best handle, how to best care for works of art, for sure.
There's a question in the back.
Me again. Casey, given that we are surrounded by plastic in our everyday lives, what is, maybe you can't say across the board, but are we going to continue to face, as we collect things that are plastic, or we're going to continue to face these degrading objects in our collections, or is the plastic today somehow, not going to say better, because it's not better, but different in terms of its longevity?
Sure, good question. A lot of the more recent modern, what we call modern plastics, are more stable. They've incorporated ultraviolet stabilizers and various other compounds so that they don't deteriorate as fast. But they also haven't been around as long, so we're not quite sure. We used to think that polyethylene and some of the more stable plastics were here forever, and now we're finding that we're seeing instances of them oxidizing and becoming brittle and not working for the long run. So we can't stop collecting. It's a huge segment of our material culture. So much of our 19th and 20th century material culture, and especially 21st, now that we're starting to collect 21st century artifacts, is made of plastic, various plastics. So we can't stop collecting them, we can't fix them once they do deteriorate. So what we're left with right now is preserving them as best as we can as we collect them. And we do, of course, have a very considered collecting policy here and a collections committee. So one of the things that we take into consideration is, can we properly care for these objects that are being donated or purchased or however they're coming into our care, are we able to take care of them? And sometimes we aren't, and at that point, we do have an opportunity to say, we have no business collecting this because we can't care for that. Things that come to mind are fire trucks and airplanes and things like that. But certainly plastics, we have to be very considered. But we can't stop collecting them, we have to find a way to preserve them.
Thank you, Casey. Well, I think what we'll do now is take a few minutes to reset, turn the lights back down, maybe we'll move these chairs up from the front, and we'll prepare ourselves for Director Yumalisa's comments. So if you'd like to take a short break and come back in just 5 minutes, we'll see you soon.